Welcome back to Michael Van Cleek's series on architecture. Today we're going to start talking about what we talk about when we talk about architecture. I know I had a first episode out there where I kind of gave you a high overview of what we were going to talk about. A lot of technical architecture. That's my big focus. Enterprise architecture, software architecture. But to understand those concepts, we got to start with the basics of what is architecture. And so we're going to walk through this map I've created to give you some of the highlights. We're going to go from the what it is. We're going to talk about the three fundamental laws. We're going to talk about pattern languages and axioms that are derived from architecture. I also scattered a few rules around here. Things like, good architecture endures, but bad architecture disappears or proliferates. These are some of my own little statements about architecture. We're going to go through all of that step by step as we go through the mind map. So anyways, I'm going to get in here today and start talking about the definition of architecture, give you some of the basic concepts. By the time you go away from this today, at least you'll know when we say the word architecture in whatever context, you'll have a good understanding of what that means, what it is. So I use the Oxford English Dictionary to help get me focused on this. We're refocusing too. I'm using some new features on the MindNode software to try to make it a little clearer, a little easier for everybody to follow. Focusing on the what it is, this comes from the basically comes from the Oxford English Dictionary, which I've got right here, the shorter version of it. There's three main things that it talks about when we talk about architecture. We talk about the process, we talk about the product, and we talk about the style. Process is how a thing is built. Product, that's what we build. The architecture is the result of this process, of this architecture process, and it has an architectural style applied to it. So you see this in buildings. You see the creation of buildings that are adapted to their local natural materials. You'll see stone carving or laying brick. That's part of the process, part of the architecture. It has to be considered in designing the building. The style, I've simplified it here by saying who is it built for. The style means so much more than that. It's a manner and a mechanism. But ultimately, it's all about the people and about the aesthetic parts of architecture. So you combine the process of building something, the product of building something, and the style of building something, that really gives you architecture. And one thing that I add to this is the future of the item. All of these things take a time dimension as well, not just looking into the past, but looking into the future. So that's what it is when we talk about architecture. Those are the three basic things that define an architecture: the process, the product, and the style. Now, having talked about that, we're going to go into talk about some of the fundamental laws of architecture. What defines an architecture? What makes an architecture successful? These come from a guy named Vitruvius, a Roman writer. And side note on that, just the where architecture comes from. The origins of architecture, of course, are mixed, and every culture is going to have their own origins. But you take a look at what we're doing with architecture. You're trying to take people gathering in tents, people gathering around a field, just using up the land as they can, but not making best use of the resources. And architecture manifested itself from that thought of, well, we've got all these people that need to live together. We've got all these things we need to do. How can we consider a bigger picture rather than just our day-to-day survival? How can we consider the larger picture in bringing these people together in growing something? How can we envision what a future might look like for these people? This was before we really even have constructs of society. We're just trying to bring people together. And that's where the roots of architecture come from. It's that beginning to think in a bigger level, that beginning to think in higher level abstractions. It's one of those things that makes humans unique and different from animals, our ability to do that, our ability to think architecturally. So we already talked about the things that are the architecture: the process, the style, and what is built. Now I want to talk about the sort of fundamental laws that Vitruvius, the first Roman writer that we have, really the first record we have in Western literature of architecture. And I'd like to know more about Eastern. I have to admit, I don't know a lot about Eastern architectures, and I'll learn more about them as we go through the process here. But Vitruvius was the Western architecture, wrote like the 10 fundamental books, and he had three fundamental laws he talked about that define an architecture. Firmness, which is the structural adequacy, the firmness, the ability for the structure to withstand its conditions and to exist in its conditions. The utilitas, the functional adequacy, the ability for the structure to be used. If we've built something that's to be a cafe, do people want to hang out in the front of it? If we've built an application that's supposed to serve people sports scores, are they coming online to see those scores in a good time? That's the utilitas. And then the venustas, the beauty, the delight. This is what, again, separates architecture from just straight up rubber stamp manufacturing. And this is what really separates good architecture from bad architecture, in my own personal opinion, is the aesthetics. You don't have architecture if there's not beauty, if there's not something in it that is conceptually beautiful, aesthetically beautiful, pleases the senses. Same thing in code. Every coder has coded good systems and bad systems, systems that were well architected, systems that weren't. Writing code for a system that's beautifully architected, that is an act of beauty. It's an act of art. Trying to fit code into systems that don't have an architecture, just scattered rocks, it's like stubbing your toe on rocks on a sandy beach. So today we've kicked it off here a bit, talking about the earliest parts of my what we talk about when we talk about architecture. We've talked about the definition of architecture, the process, product, and style. We've talked about the three fundamental laws, the firmness, utilitas, and venustas. Who knows if my Latin's any good? That's where we're going to begin this series, and we're going to dive into some of the pattern languages, some of the axioms derived from architecture in the next series, start getting into some of the more technical architectures, and then start getting into specific patterns, axioms, and ideas that come from Michael Van Cleek's view of architecture. Thank you for joining me.